And of course, colleagues, Glenn, Prof, and our able presidents from Red, and so many of you here who are friends and colleagues. It's a pleasure to see you again. Of course, also colleagues from Family Homes Funds. Let me also thank my brother, PS, as I call him. I think I will have to add Sky to it. It's a pleasure again to be here, and as always, I have to recognize your resilience. I don't know how you guys organize these conferences. When I see your emails at 2 a.m. and you are supposed to be retired, I said, this guy still works all these hours. I'm really glad. I attended the very first of these cooperative houses in 2018, so that's about 7 years ago, and to see that you are still going strong on it, I really doff my hat for you. And finally, I have colleagues here from the Cooperative Mortgage Bank, on whose platform I stand. They are here. Thank you very much, colleagues from Cooperative Mortgage Bank. And for all of you cooperatives who are here and looking for money, don't complain. Speak to them. They are here, and they can help you. So I understand I have about 15 minutes. And I prepared a slide. But one of the privileges of being a retiree is that you can really do things your way. And when I walked in here this morning, I decided that I didn't want to make that presentation. And what I wanted to do was to speak to you from my heart, what I see. Because after having done these hundreds of times, as I said, the very first of these conferences was in 2018, and I also presented then. I asked myself, what is new? We could talk about all the technicalities of what you can do or not do. It seems to me that our issue is not about not knowing what to do. Our issue is finding the courage and the conviction to do it. And a PowerPoint presentation doesn't do it as well as me speaking directly to you from my heart. So I hope that today you will listen to me. I have only one expectation from this presentation and from this conference, that after 7 years, we will move the needle. We will move the needle because time is not on our side. One of the very few things that keep me awake about Nigeria is that in 25 years' time, and when I look at the very young and bright faces around the room, by God's grace, many of us will be alive in 25 years' time. There will be about 400 million Nigerians on this soil. Cities like Abuja, Lagos will not be recognizable. 65% of those people will be living in our cities. And 70% of them will be under the age of 25. Young, not without a lot of money, but needing housing. Where are we going to house them? And if they are not housed, or they are housed inadequately, we have created a gunpowder keg of serious social problems, of crime, of health inequalities, of significant issues for our development. Time is not what? Is not on our side. So it's critical that we move away from theorizing about the issues and actually find out and understand what is it that is stopping us from actually getting the results that we need. So I'm going to choose my battle in making this presentation today. And I want to do 3 things. First, because I have to do it, but it's not new to many of it. In fact, you will find that I'm quoting some of the papers that Professor Nubi has written. Is about what is our current state in terms of the cooperative movement. What does data and literature tell us about the potential of the cooperative movement? And within that discussion, what is the reality of what cooperatives are actually doing versus the potential? What does their report card look like? So let us first confront that issue. I will then go on to the second part, and as I see it, outline what I see as the major barriers that is responsible for the outcomes that we now have, particularly in respect of the cooperative movement and its ability to achieve the potential that it has to help us or at least to contribute meaningfully in addressing this social problem that is accelerating our way. Okay? And then finally, I want to drop 3 or 4 proposals, primarily for the organizers. Some concrete proposals of things that we need to action and to do. And I believe are within our will and our powers. I have learned that the way to get things done is let's not rely on somebody else. There are a lot of people around this room can do to move the needle. So that is where I start from. Okay? So cooperatives and housing delivery. As I said, look, the concept of cooperatives, which is really self-help, is not new to us as Nigerians or Africans. Okay, it's not new. This has been part of African and Nigerian societies for centuries. So let us not be deceived and be intimidated as if it is something that is new to us. A lot of our societies, a lot of our communities developed on the back of the principles of mutuality, self-help, and people working together to actualize their dreams. However, as in several parts of the world, it is now established about the significant roles that cooperatives can play in affordable housing delivery. I'll be cautious to say that it is the only thing. We need to be careful of extremism. Cooperative movements can contribute significantly to meeting our housing needs. But let us not say that is the only thing. I personally don't agree with that. There are a number of studies. One study suggests that if some of the regulatory and operational reforms that we'll talk about today are implemented, our cooperatives can realistically scale up to deliver 15 to 25% of Nigeria's national housing need, approximately 140,000 homes a year. That is more than any other current program is. Even our Renewed Hope housing program and the one before it and the one before it dare not make that kind of expectation. But all of the studies suggest that you can do it. And this is consistent with the size of the cooperative movement. So if you look at different data, EFINA, a research company, said as of 2010, there were about 82,400 cooperative groups with 1.4 million members. I think that is underestimated because a more recent study by Crassen, which is the Cooperative Ratings and Awards Society, mentions there are probably over 300,000 cooperative societies with a membership exceeding 30 million. I think CFN itself puts it about 21 million. But look, that is a wide range, but we are probably between that 21 million Nigerians and 30 million Nigerians who belong to a cooperative. Crassen also said that in 2023, those cooperatives mobilized about 1.8 trillion naira in savings and disbursed about 1.3 billion naira in loans to its members in 2023. So significant capital. Whilst we need to have a caveat around these figures because a lot of them were drawn from extrapolation of various data, I think what it does do is give us an indication of the muscle that cooperatives can have and how they can deploy that. A study by another academic, Oyalowo, I think Ebawale in 2010, said they looked at a number of cooperatives in Oyo State, and they found that 31% of the loans that those cooperatives give were given for housing purposes. So if you try to use those two data and say, look, if on average they were using up to 31% of their loanable funds, which we thought in 2023 was 1.3 million, it means that there's a possibility that cooperatives in this country were using or disbursing up to 400 billion naira into housing. I don't know of any other of our three legs of housing finance that is making that investment into housing today. Okay? So there is a significant financial muscle that is resident in cooperatives in terms of what they do. Another way that I've looked at this is that if you assume a 50% redundancy, so we say that of the 30 million Nigerians who belong to a cooperative, about 50% are not doing anything. You know, they're not contributing a penny, they're really just dormant. So we have 15 million people. So I used the data. NCC, so our National Communications Commission, said the average Nigerian at the end of 2024 report was spending 3,500 naira per month on phone calls. Okay? So another important human, so I grabbed that data. I said, so assuming we had 15 million people spending the same thing they spend on making telephone calls, okay, or investing the same thing they spend on making telephone calls per month into their housing need, we will probably get about 52.5 billion naira per month in funds into a pot that can support the delivery of housing. That translates into about 630 billion naira per annum. What is our annual budget for housing this year? Can anybody guess? 100 billion. So capital, which is delivery, was everything. So capital delivery was about 70. So you're absolutely right, sir. So about 10 times what the public sector, the state is investing in housing. So that gives you, just in terms of numbers, the kind of potential. There are a million ways in which you can play around with these numbers and dimension these numbers, but the key point that I want to make is really to be clear about the potential of the cooperative movement, not only to be a significant contributor to housing delivery, but at least to complement the other sectors, the government, the capital markets, and the private sector. And all of these are consistent. I've just spent about 10 days in Nairobi, and one of the studies that came out of that was that 90% of housing finance in Kenya is coming from SACCOs and cooperatives. They pretty much are driving the housing finance. And we are nowhere near that, but there's no reason why we cannot push from where we are. So that is the potential. What then is our reality in terms of delivery? You know, all of the, again, we struggle with data, so thank God now for ChatGPT, you really have to dig in to find data. That how much of the housing, how much of their potential 140,000 units a year are cooperatives actually producing? How much of it are they actually producing? How much of it are they actually promoting? You know, all of the data from all of the academics is the fact that actually from some were very generous to cooperatives and say, look, their contribution to housing supply and even demand in the country with all of that money is actually quite modest. way short of where the potential could be. Damole 2014 said actually it's insignificant. So that was his own finding in his study, that it was actually totally insignificant contribution to the supply of housing through direct contribution. My view is it's probably not insignificant, but it's far less than what it could be. So the question is that what are the primary barriers? What are the roadblocks that's facing housing cooperatives in realizing their potential? And I hope that that is really what this conference focuses on. How can we help you to unlock those barriers? Because it can be done. It is being done. I mentioned Nairobi. Most of Namibia, East and Southern Africa's housing markets are being significantly driven by mutuals. There is no reason why we can't do it. But what are the key things that constitute the roadblocks for us? So let me go through 4 of them that I identify as big ones that we really need to look at. And I think this conference, the first one is the regulatory framework. The regulatory framework around cooperatives. And there are 2 perspectives to that. The first one is that the regulatory framework generally does not proactively promote growth of our cooperatives and their scale. A lot of inherent bureaucracy, apart from the fact that the regulations that currently exist themselves are significantly obsolete. You know, and I will quote here because I saw a paper that Dr. Nubi and his colleagues, Professor Yalowo, Professor Lawansin, I'm sure you remember 2019, did on that. And it was interesting, it was based in Lagos. So let me give you some examples of what the regulation suggests. So it says that, for example, one, because the cooperative laws have become obsolete, in Lagos, the department really now regulates via what is called operational guidelines. Okay? So let's listen to some of the guidelines. It says that it is required that cooperative societies inform the ministry before they go into land purchase. Any society that is willing to embark on investment in land must first get the consent of the Director of Cooperative Services before embarking on such projects. Okay? So you first have to talk to the director. The director may or may not allow you to do that. Secondly, it says that when cooperative societies embark on land acquisitions, they must ensure that only the funds of members who are interested in buying the land is tied into land acquisition rather than the savings of members. Okay, so that is the operational guideline there. Then it says long-term loan facilities meant for the financing of cooperative housing projects and other long-term projects may be tolerated, but an approval must be obtained from the general members of the cooperatives and subsequently the director of cooperatives before they get approval. So there's a whole layer of process if we do. Now, one of the outcomes of that was that a lot of these regulations and the guidelines were meant and developed for general purpose cooperatives. So we actually don't have any body of regulation or controls for cooperatives that are dedicated specifically for housing. And this is quite strange because in all of the countries where we work, we find that where there's been a lot of development around cooperatives activity, there are very specific body of controls about how cooperatives in a controlled fashion are able to invest in housing without having their hands tied behind their back. So this is a big issue that needs to be, that has been a big holdback for cooperatives achieving the potential that they have. The second big issue which we must address is the limited capital that cooperatives have. So see the paradox here. So on one hand, we're saying that cooperatives have the potential to mobilize a lot of capital. But the reality is that actually most of them are really sitting on very minimum amount of capital. You know, some of the studies, a 2013 study by Adeboye Oderinde in Southwest, particularly Oyo State, it looked at 417 cooperatives. Of the 417 cooperatives, more than 50% of them, precisely 237, had a capital base of between 5 and 9 million naira. That's about $3,000 to $6,000. So we have a number, the significant undercapitalization of cooperatives, and it then said that outside of that study, as a general literature review, only a very small minority of cooperatives have a balance sheet that is in excess of 1 billion Nigerian naira. In a real estate market that is significantly capital intensive. And, you know, let me now say example. So you find in Kenya that of the 175 licensed and regulated circles, between them they have a combined capitalization of about $3.8 billion. Okay, so that immediately gives you part of the reason why you can see one activity here and a much less activity on the other side. We'll go on and talk about what are the key things that we need to do to support cooperatives to strengthen their capitalization. The third key thing is operational challenges. Just before I came on, one of the Goodwill messages talked about cooperatives and land grabbing and all of these things. The process of real estate and development is high risk, it is complex, and part of the finding is that a lot of cooperatives struggle with the technical process of actually implementing, making the right choices, implementing projects. Limited financial skills to evaluate feasibility, limited due diligence capabilities, and even the ongoing management on development, management of their developments. And apart from that, even in the day-to-day management of their own activities, and this is not criticizing cooperatives, I think I'm not saying something that you don't know. In the day-to-day management of your own activities and our engagement with your members, most cooperatives are still relying on archaic manual processes, especially in relation to real estate investment. We have seen some big progress in agriculture, and I think that that needs to spill over into cooperatives that are investing in housing. Then, of course, we have the big one, the big elephant in the room, and that is the governance problems. And that's the one that we don't want to talk about. I heard the gentleman from the Code of Conduct Bureau about corruption. This is a big elephant in the room, and we have to talk about it. Otherwise, capital will not flow. Real estate projects will fail because there are significant corporate governance gaps in a cooperative movement. The issue of leadership is a serious challenge to most cooperatives. Bad leadership has hamstrung the development of many cooperatives because it causes them for a movement that is based on trust, that is based on mutuality. There is no worse thing that can happen to it than poor corporate governance and lack of transparency, and which only leads to a loss of confidence among members about the integrity and steadfastness of their leaders, which ultimately leads to the failure of the cooperative movement. We must address that today. How can a corporate governance code that is published, is measurable, be established for cooperatives, particularly housing cooperatives? If we don't deal with that, we are just playing around. So what is the way forward? As I said, and as I close, I want to make 4 key proposals for consideration. The first one is that we need to work together concertedly to establish and recognize housing cooperatives as a distinct segment within the cooperative movement. And that includes development of appropriate regulatory frameworks and structures. And the regulatory focus should be on offering protection to savers, confidence to investors, and private sources of capital. We should focus on enabling access to private capital, the capital market without overbearing supervision, and secondly, the establishment of an aggregator similar to what they have in Kenya, in Tanzania, Namibia. I think the Kenyan one is called NACHU, National Association of Cooperative Housing Unions, to provide services to particularly the smaller cooperatives who may on their own or be unable to support or have the skills to develop their own housing project. So that's the first one. The establishment of housing cooperatives as a distinct sub-sector of the wider cooperative movement. Last week, I partly joined a delegation that was visiting Nairobi from the Ministry of Agriculture. I think Dr. Sky kind of threw me into that. And there was a lot of discussion about cooperatives. But they were all rice farmers, banana planting people. There was no discussion really about housing. Okay, no discussion about that. We need to establish that. And actually, a lot of the studies has already said that one of the main, in fact, the primary reason, the most significant reason people join cooperatives is also as a way to meeting their housing need. So it's important that we establish that as a critical sector within the housing movement and back it up with the necessary regulation. The second practical step is that I think addresses the capital issue is we need to, as a first step, explore the extension of the refinancing facility that we currently have, NMRC, that allows the cooperatives to at least be able to revolve their capital. We already have a refinancing facility. We need to have a discussion with the refinancing facility about some flexibility in its underwriting framework that enables it to refinance the facilities that cooperatives are given. It will be an interesting one because of the low cost of borrowing that they have. The next bit, third option, is the Housing Development Advisory Service. One of the reasons that has impacted the scaling up of housing cooperatives has been many have got their hands burnt from doing development projects. Either they bought land that they suddenly found it was not their land, or they gave something to a contractor, pretty much lost members' money. I think, which is not unusual because real estate is complicated, I think the establishment of an advisory, a centralized or even partially aggregated advisory service that is able to support small and medium-sized cooperatives to be able to develop projects is going to help to scale up the contribution of housing cooperatives into housing. And finally, digitalization and technology. How can we make the process and the engagement with savers, which is where the competitive advantage of cooperative is, much more effective? So, Glenn is here and all of these other people. How can we bring that into the new age of technology and digitization? We need to think seriously about that and develop with an appropriate and accessible mechanism that improves engagement with our savers. It improves engagement, it improves transparency. We need to look at a technology policy that de-risks the development projects, provides information on housing opportunities for members. But also breaks the barriers between individual cooperatives. So I have seen in a previous role where you have one cooperative where they have their members who are saying we need housing. And literally about a mile away, another cooperative has houses that is unable to sell. But the two people are not speaking to each other. There is no platform. Can we develop a technology platform that serves as a marketplace for cooperatives? And of course, again, part of the challenge in terms of regulatory support for cooperatives is the lack of transparency around the impacts that they are actually making. Does the technology platform enable us to track and report on the impact that you are making? So that is something for you. Let me finish with this. Let me finish with this, because I know that this is what happens. I genuinely believe that tackling the housing crisis and indeed turning it into an opportunity should not be a competitive sport. It should not be a competitive sport. Because what tends to happen is that once something starts, somebody else says, is it only you? You should be this. It is lack of understanding of the scale of the problem that we have. I tell people that 5 FHAs, 5 family-owned funds, 5 federal mortgage banks are not enough to meet our housing problem. So it's not a competitive sport. Okay, so it should not be, no, this we should have, it should be this, let's shoot this down. We must make a decisive effort to boost, to support the contribution that cooperatives can make to housing delivery. It is something that we have to do. We need everybody's hand on board. It should not be them and us. There is no mutual exclusivity there. We need every technology that we can get. We need every institution that we can get. We need every segment of government that we can get. I pray that we will be able to finally, after year 7, since this discussion began, and that was a discussion I had with PS, that we need to do something. And I hope that over the next couple of days, that our discussion will be taking forward this agenda in a practical and decisive way. Thank you very much.